we've been able to assemble a real team of visionaries to assess where this industry is, where it's going, and what we should try and keep in mind as we go forward on the journey. So I'm really honored to be able to welcome to the stage Bill Weiland, the founder and CEO of Presence Marketing, Gary Hirshberg, the co-founder and chief organic optimist of Stonyfield Farm, and Shazi Visram, the founder and chairmom of Happy Family Brands. I don't want to waste too much time on introductions. You guys...
We know each other.
Yeah,
you guys know... but I do want to start by asking you, because you've all been incredibly influential, both entrepreneurs, company builders. Looking down the runway 5 years from now, what do you think is the single most influential idea that's going to affect the runway for the entrepreneurs in the audience?
You want to start with me?
Absolutely.
Well, as a mother, I'm certainly the person in the household that thinks about the health of my children and the products that we're buying. And from my purview, I believe that health and wellness is going to center around managing inflammation over the next many years. And I think that the products that can successfully, meaningfully, truly impact not just a sense of health and wellness, but actual healing are the future.
So food as medicine?
Food as medicine, understanding that some foods actually really deteriorate from our experience in life and some really add to it. And then as we layer on this new world of, I would say, environmentally caused chronic illness, there's so much where I think people are becoming much more individually responsible for their health in the way that they never have been before. And I think the brands that can offer solutions in a transparent way and in a clear way to those consumers are going to win.
All right.
Yeah, I agree with her completely. Surprise.
We're friends.
Look, I would just add radical honesty, radical transparency, no bullshit. You know, we have been running lots and lots of surveys with millennials, millennial moms. Half of all millennials are now parents. They have the internet is the most trusted source for information. They have unlimited access to everything. There are drones. There are countless ways to know how the food is being produced or grown. And I think a carpenter friend of mine says, the reason he does carpentry is you can't bullshit a nail, right? I think in the food business, we can't bullshit our consumer. So I think, preventative health is the cheapest form of healthcare. There is food is it, and we're going to have more and more chronic illness and disease because of what we've been doing to ourselves. And so moms in particular are going to have a voracious appetite for truth.
Isn't there a corollary that we're sort of drowning in information right now, and that it's hard to separate out the truth from all the signal or from all the noise?
Do you want to respond to that first?
Are we talking about alternative facts?
Sure. I guess it's better to have too much information than not enough. Plus, when it comes to things like health and wellness, it's a bit of a subjective conversation. So I think it's important. Let's face it, there's going to be natural soda companies that build in the next 5 years, and I would have a hard time arguing those are calories that count, even if it's half the sugar, 20 grams per 12 ounces or something like that. But those are filling important niches in the marketplace, and I think it's most important that you bring quality and that your company has some transparent values proposition. Think about 10 years ago. Consumers didn't vote with their dollars because of what companies did or didn't do for the environment or various social causes. Today, they do. I mean, today it was always important to the gatekeeper. Now it's important to the consumer, but it's also just the right thing to do. Build in the kind of infrastructure where you can afford to give back, and to that end, have appropriate margins in your product and line yourself up with a good financing partner, smart money, that's going to help you build during turbulent times.
Yeah, look, I don't think, I do think there's information overload, and I'm not, and one of the reasons I agree with Bill is I don't think, you know, in my run-up from the 80s to recently, the adage, the paradigm was keep your gross margins as strong as possible so you can use the money for A&P, right, to communicate. A&P doesn't work anymore.
Sure.
It doesn't. It's people are overwhelmed with messaging, and most millennials don't listen to ads. They'll just click right past it. Or it's the honesty I'm talking about is actually in what you do. It's what's on your pack. It's on what's on your website. It's the information you make available. I have seen lots of companies get exposed by drones and other sort of means of that influencers have had to open up those doors. I'm suggesting companies that go pro. If you got it, then tell it. Go proactive with it. That doesn't mean buy advertising and promotion. It means make it available for the consumer who is going to be looking. Shazi's. We're dear buddies. I think I can say this. Shazi has a child who's autistic, and we all know the statistics now. They're out of control. And we know that brain development is, there's a variety of environmental factors. And you only need to be touched, you only need your child to have one health incident to become just a killer, voracious defender. And you're going to go overtime to find out and be sure that, you're not going to believe what a company claims. So you've got to make stuff available so that influencers, third-party folks, bloggers, and others can translate for that cynical and justifiably cynical mom or parent that this is or is not the real deal.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing is transparency is great if at the core there's authenticity.
Right.
If it's bullshit and you're very open about it, it's clearly bullshit.
What about accuracy? Not even authenticity.
Well, it's part of the same.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're going to get found out. Okay, the high talk-do ratio, the higher the gap, the more vulnerable you are.
So then we have brands, we see brands come across our desk all the time that make claims, that hint at claims, that pursue certain diets or ideas. One of the things that we talked about when we were prepping for this was this idea of the trend versus the fad and how you market to the long term. Is it possible to get a short-term lift from saying, look, I'm speaking to something that's important right now, and also broaden out into the larger trend and still be truthful as you do it?
I think absolutely. I'm sure Bill sees it every day with products that are selling really well, and we all have a certain appetite for a number of things, right? And I think that just in the sense that I think the trend towards transparency is a never-ending trend. And I think that when consumers now look at products and they have options, they're going to move towards the ones that are not just the what, but the why, and many times the who. And I think those are the ones that kind of have the perfect triumvirate of success ratio. If there's a truly great product and the right people behind it for the right reasons, it's just hard for that one not to win. That doesn't mean there aren't just like fun, indulgent products that aren't going to do well. I think that's part of our society, and it's part of enjoying life. But I do think consumers will consistently make better choices given the information they have access to digitally, and that's just part of that's not a fad. That's a trend.
So also with specifically related to food trends, sometimes products can serve the same consumer set, but one fall in more of the fad bucket, one in the trend bucket. Give you an example. Paleo is a fad, make no mistake about it. It is based on a very specific group of foods available in the Paleolithic area. It's a little bit more restrictive, but the overarching theme of people being more conscious about their carbohydrate intake. So grain-free, again, serving the same consumer set long term. Guarantee you guys, 25 years from now, some of the best-selling products in every category in the store are going to be grain-free, because products that heretofore were not valuable in nutrition, like an organic blueberry muffin made with white flour. It's a high glycemic spike. It's better than one made with bleached flour, but those aren't great calories. All of a sudden, you make that with almond flour, you make it with coconut, you make it with flax, you make it with other seeds, and those are reasonably to very good calories. So grain-free long-term. Fads are things that are going to spike, or even subsets like protein chips. Forget about it. Not a long-term play. Protein cookies, a long-term play. Differentiation. If you put protein into a cookie, a person can justify, hey, instead of a muffin, it's a little lower sugar, it's got oats in it, it's got 15 grams of protein, it feels wholesome. It more falls into the bar category. So it's being very thoughtful when you look at changing consumer notions, which, by the way, are importantly based on real information and intelligence. So you could say that in general, the marketplace is driven less today by fads and solar flare-ups than it is by sustainable trends.
But
Yeah,
you
and
have, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, here's a trend. We now know 1 in 2 men, 1 in 3 women are going to get cancer in our lifetimes. Those numbers are only going up. We know that now that cancer is an inflammatory disease. That is to say that if in our slow evolution as humans, we've been focused on the wrong end of the equation, right, on treatment as opposed to prevention. We know that there are conditions, there are foods, there are behaviors that are pro-inflammatory and anti-inflammatory. Sugar is a pro-inflammatory. It grows cell tissue, and cancer cells feed on sugar. Lack of exercise, by the way, is, or I should say more positively, exercise is an anti-inflammatory behavior. Mental and emotional well-being is anti-inflammatory.
Well, I'm screwed there.
Yeah. But you began by challenging us, well, where are things going in 5 years? We're going to understand this stuff in the next couple of years. And so, again, I would resist the temptation to leap on fads, and I would also resist the temptation to make claims that are either not true or not yet true. Let the consumer, let the third-party validator.
That yet word, I think, is important, though. And I'm glad you mentioned in 5 years we're going to know a lot more than we do now, because we're still, with some of the food as medicine, hinting at it, focusing on it. We're basing it on surveys of surveys. The science is not all the way comparable to where people want it to be, and we go by feel, and we go by who we are and what our diets are, and sort of, the ancestry can play a role, but we don't have it nailed yet.
Well, let me give you a data point, because I do have a kid with autism. And 15 years ago, or 20 years ago, it was 1 in 10,000 children would have a diagnosis of autism. Now it's, as of a few weeks ago, the new CDC data is 1 in 59, okay? And in New Jersey, it's 1 in 26 boys, because New Jersey's probably the most toxic state in the country. So just a side note, just not big data, small data. If you're one of the 1 in 59 families that just got an autism diagnosis, and one of the first things the doctor says is, we don't really have much to tell you as to how to treat your child. There's some therapy and there's some things you can do. One of the things that families do try where they see better behavior is removing gluten and dairy from your diets, your child. Guess what? Nobody in my house eats gluten or dairy anymore.
Right.
So, I mean, it's a small data point that, you're right, the science is not totally there. But
you all dig in.
But you dig in and you try to learn and you try to understand, well, okay, is there a relationship with inflammation in the gut and inflammation in the brain? The science will say yes. And can we point to things that are pro-inflammatory, and do we remove them? I don't want to stay on inflammation forever. It's not my whole thing, but it's just a data point as to how these things do become long-term.
Well, and it's not
Yeah.
just inflammation. I mean, in the case of autism in particular, or brain development in general, there's now a clear link with pesticides in the scientific world making its way into the lay world. We just did an interesting survey. 69% of consumers who choose organic choose it to avoid reduce exposure of pesticides to their consumers. No surprise there. 66% of consumers never think about where their kids play. And it turns out that 91% of America's playing fields and parks are sprayed with a cocktail of 3 neurotoxins, of 3 herbicides that act as neurotoxins, and in fact, all 3 have been linked to brain development and autism, IQ, dicamba, 2,4-D, and glyphosate. Turns out that kids playing in fields, with our skin being the biggest organ in our body, probably have more exposure than they get even through eating. And so when you pick up the soccer ball and go out and play, and I'm sorry to freak out the parents here, but this is an opportunity for us. Stonyfield has launched for our 35th year a project called Stonyfields to adopt 35 communities around the country based on the work of some incredibly visionary moms out in Irvine, California, to make parks and fields organic.
And that is a terrific movement. And I was about to ask whether Stonyfield would soon be advocating for AstroTurf fields, which are considered another
quite to the
alternative.
Contrary. No, but it's so I'm a 20-year premier soccer coach with all 3 of my kids, and I'm in a state of mourning right now because the turf fields are actually worse than the grass fields. The crushed up tires, rubber tires, are loaded with lead, loaded with heavy metals. Think about those tires picking up all this stuff. They're dust, they're heat, blah, blah, blah. Don't get off the turf fields. In fact, we're advocating converting back. The answer is organic. It's the same with agriculture. But my real point in mentioning this in this context is that, again, back to our theme here, what should brands be doing? Well, you said, is there information overload? I think what counts more than what we say is what we do.
Sure.
And I think, frankly, Stonyfield was on a 20-some-odd% annual compounded growth rate for 20-plus years until about 8 years ago. And now, I'm pleased to say that the new owners, well, some small changes, but the little ownership change there. But the new owners have said, yeah, pull out the stops, get back to what you were doing, and this is exactly what we're doing now. In other words, what we're saying to our consumers, look, it doesn't matter how much organic you eat if your kid's out there playing every day on these fields. So I would urge brands here who are thinking about how to build that loyal, honest, high-integrity relationship, focus less on what you're going to say and focus more on your behaviors, and show the parent, show that you're really here to be their friend.
2 questions follow that. One is, what's the role of what role should the big food companies have in driving change, and what role are they playing?
Well, the role that they're playing is all over the board. Some aren't doing much, and some are jumping all in. Look at General Mills, driving thousands and thousands more acreage for organic farming, and investing in brands and allowing the entrepreneurs to stay involved and build from a position of strength. So it's so much better that the large consumer products goods companies, as a general movement, are not line extending stale old brands with questionable ingredients, but are investing in the growth of natural and organic. It's very complicated to say, how do we optimize that, of course. Sometimes they're overpaying for brands, and there's a big hit on the share price, right? Big hit on the share price and earnings in order to stay relevant in the game. But you have to say that it's an important part of the ecosystem to have large acquisitor focused firmly on value-added products. And you could also argue that they're in the best position to accelerate change compared to any other segment in the market.
Because they have the sort of force, the exponential force driver of distribution.
We got to educate kids when they're young. We got to get to the school systems, right? Community gardens, going to these food deserts. get with local politicians, get some federal funding, encourage people to go into these food deserts with education, retail outlets, security, support, so we can catch them when they're young, give them some calories that count, so they perform better at school, kids are healthier, craving less junk. I mean, it's the acceleration of the movement. You go to a bodega down the street in New York right now. I was 1 o'clock in the morning last night, went to get some bottled water, some snacks. A high percentage of those stores now are clean ingredient deck and a lot of organic.
7-Eleven.
Yeah.
And where in a bodega in Manhattan, there's, which is per square foot, one of the highest cost cities in the world. One of the questions that I've asked you to consider is, how do we kind of bridge the gap and not have two food systems, one that's really undemocratically priced?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, your last two questions go hand in hand. I mean, look, let me just say, I've been a champion of what Bill just talked about for a long time. I was involved with Honest Tea and Happy and lots of companies that have sold out to larger companies. I'm more sanguine about that now. 10 years into it, I see that the large companies who typically overpaid and therefore are chasing multiples that are hard, if not impossible to reach, tend to squeeze these companies more than they should. The answer is volume. The answer to the and the leverage of volume and scale is what gets you done. That's the only way you can pay the farmer the proper price for, in this case, growing organic foods, and still at the same time be competitive out there. But you need an enlightened leadership in these large companies, and they're far and few between. And I would say that I'm seeing some positive trends with some of the folks who've been mentioned, but I've also seen some real negative ones as well. And we've both experienced that.
But I'll say, so for instance, Group Janone has now, they fully own Happy Family. We are the #1 organic baby brand in the country. We're the #2 baby brand in the country, next to Gerber. I mean, that's huge. I wouldn't say necessarily that they've helped from a logistics and distribution standpoint yet, but it's coming. But they are now the largest public benefit corp in the world.
Yeah.
And I feel proud to have pushed them in that direction because it keeps them honest. But one thing I will say is we, as a community of food entrepreneurs and leaders who see a brighter future for our children, don't need to always distrust big food, because there's some value there to the experience, not just around the logistics and distribution, and maybe that's what they do in the end because we're so great at innovating and marketing and storytelling. But there's also something to be said about quality and safety. So there's a bunch of people with great ideas, but for instance, in my case, I mean, we were one of the fastest growing companies in the country making baby food, which is the most vulnerable population. At the time, I was quite happy to feel like under the wing of someone who had been managing quality control for baby food for almost 100 years. It's not always all bad. Big isn't all bad. It just can be slow.
It's the how.
It's interesting because our very first speaker 2 days ago, Seth Goldman, who you are all fairly familiar with, was talking about food safety as the primary concern right from the start. And I think that's sort of where it begins and ends, is people here are trying to create a safer food system. They're trying to create safer foods. And I just want to thank you all for your leadership in doing that. And I look forward to having you work with all of us in the future. So thank you very much.
Yeah, you bet.
Sure, it's our pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.